activating the lab of the future through an open, modular, and cloud-native approach is what we're going to be talking about now. My name's Raveen Sharma. I have about 25 years of experience serving this space. I've worked at multiple small startup companies, and I'm currently at Deloitte, where I lead the Lab of the Future practice. With me, I'm very privileged to have Joris van Dam, who's making his way up. Joris is a data and digital healthcare entrepreneur with 20 years of experience. He spent the majority of that time in pharma R&D and diagnostics, liberating data from the labs, clinical research, and clinical practice to accelerate development of new drugs and therapeutics to amplify their impact on public health outcomes. Earlier this year, Joris started a new venture to democratize evidence-based care with the help of AI. So Joris is going to help talk about kind of real-world applications and kind of the battle scars that he's had with working with data and trying to get data liberated, right? So what we're going to talk about is, one, you can't ignore your labs. I'll get into, why we think that's been the case. We're seeing incredible increasing investments in this space. There's still a lot of challenges and barriers. It hasn't been solved. It's not a solved problem. We're going to talk about closing the loop between the wet lab and the dry lab. What do you need to achieve that? What are we building with AWS? And what does the roadmap look like? And then it's all about making your scientists happy, productive scientists or happy scientists. So you can't ignore your labs. So we've got three kind of vignettes, three snippets on this slide. The first is, the story of the productivity in R&D as measured by rate of return has been declining pretty much for the past 12 to 15 years. There's been a slight uptick in the last 2 years, and we're sitting at about 5.9% return on investment. And 2 points of that is directly attributed to GLP-1. So you can say for the vast majority of pharma companies, they're sitting at about 3% return on investment, which is really, really low. The other dynamic that we're seeing is loss of exclusivity. There's about 190 drugs that are going to come off patent in the next 5 years, and that represents a loss of revenue of about $250 billion, so $250 billion, right? So how do you accommodate that, right? And so you have to have a strategy of sustainable pipeline development. So, for the short-term chronic problem, if you haven't planned for it, you're going to be buying compounds, right? And the price of those compounds are going up, right? So really, as we kind of interacted and interviewed a large number of heads of research, heads of R&D in large pharma, basically, they've come to the conclusion, or they've been advocating that you need a balanced approach. You can buy compounds, obviously, but you're not going to buy yourself out of this problem. Number two is you have to invest in your own innovation engine, right? And so you really need that balanced kind of approach. And this is why we're seeing a ton of interest, a ton of investment, and a relook at your own labs, right? And this stat here kind of, alludes to it. 69% of pharma leaders believe they will lose competitive advantage if they fail to connect and automate their labs, right? So that kind of first mile problem, of getting the data off of your instruments, out of your labs, your on-prem, if you will, getting that efficiently moved to the cloud where you can start doing compute to that data and power all the ML technologies and ML products that you've been hearing about today. That's a big problem still, right? And what we're seeing is, again, there's investments being made in this space. So from the large pharma all the way to the AI native or cloud native pharma, the smaller innovative ones, if you will. But AstraZeneca, this is on their website, right? So they're very proud of the fact that they've fully automated a given lab. In this case, it's medicinal chemistry, right? In silico, they're very proud of the fact that they've got robots generating data, and it's automatically moving into this Panda Omics data environment, right? And Recursion is very proud of the fact that they've been assembling very rapidly one of the largest data sets in this area, right? So this is all great, but these are all pockets of innovation, pockets of investment, right? As a pharma company, you've got way more than a medicinal chemistry lab or a high-throughput screening operation, right? So how do you get the rest of your labs kind of, brought up to par, right? So there needs to be a way to scale. You need to scale this. The barriers that we see, I'll go through it in a second. But what this represents is there's an organization called the Pistoia Alliance that a lot of pharma companies are members of. It's a pre-competitive kind of consortium where a lot of information, good information is shared. And this is two surveys, one done in 2023, one done in 2024. And they they surveyed about 200 people, executives, lab managers, senior research scientists, R&D IT folks who support the lab operations. And they asked them, what are your top investments as you're looking forward, either both in 2023 and also in 2024? So 62% responded that they're going to be investing in AI ML, okay? So yes. Then the next kind of biggest category was 30% responded that they're going to be investing heavily. Their top investment are cloud computing platforms. Okay, that kind of makes sense. And then the next two, the number 3 and number 4, were kind of interesting, and it helped us kind of understand really what's happening, through this survey, what's happening in the labs. And one is that ELNs are being invested in heavily, right? And LIMS systems are being invested in heavily, right? So you can start kind of maybe thinking, you're hypothesizing why that might be, right? And then, the next kind of line in the slide, what are the barriers, right, when these folks were surveyed? So, they're pretty much the same in both years. Data silos, unstructured data, it's hard to process, hard to get your hands on it. In 2023, there was resistance to data sharing and collaboration, which is called the data mining problem. That data's mine, this data's mine, I'm not sharing it. It's an oldie but a goodie. So the way that got fixed is through governance and through a top-down mandate saying, if you work for this company, if you work for this organization, you are going to share data. You are going to input the metadata fields for that experiment you just designed and had executed, and you're going to share it with the rest of the community within this organization. So, we see a shift in 2024, a year later, where, you still have data silos, unstructured data, but what comes up is the lack of metadata standardization. And then that ties back into why people are investing in ELNs and LIMS systems, is you're fixing your source data. You're investing in fixing your source data so you have that entire metadata record. So somebody besides yourself who may have run that experiment can actually understand what you did, right? So that's very important before you feed it into an algorithm and have an agent do its thing on it, right? So really what's holding us back is this concept of unfair data. I don't know where it is. I don't know what the context is about it. So what unfortunately we actually see happen more often than people care to admit is because I can't figure out how that experiment was run, what the samples exactly were, what the annotations are, I'm going to run that experiment again just to make sure, right? So that's what's happening. It's unfair. So with that, Joris.
Yeah, thank you, Raveen. Great segue. We've seen some fantastic examples earlier in this session and in the keynote this morning of benefits of implementing AI in the labs, right? And that's what we try to illustrate here at an abstract level. If you do more upfront work in your dry lab, you can make better use, you can optimize the use of your scarce resources in a wet lab, right? Avoid running tests again, avoid running tests that are going nowhere. And how do you predict that? Well, you need to know what you've done in the lab before. And when I joined pharma R&D 20-odd years ago, the only way to find out what's been done in the lab before is you needed 3 things. You needed the actual data from the experiment. That was in a lab notebook. You needed a description of the experiment. That was typically in a document stored probably somewhere on eRoom, totally dating myself. And you needed a person who worked on the experiment. With AI, you can replace that third thing. Think of AI as a great tool to rummage through your data. AI is not a magic black box. You can ask Perplexity today, what test should I run in my wet lab next? And it's going to tell you something, but it's going to be rubbish. The real power of AI is feeding all your prior tests to the AI model and then asking that same question again. That's where the real power comes to bear. So how do you unlock that power? By making your data rummageable. The real term is fair, right? Findable, accessible, integratable, reusable. But that's what we're talking about here. And again, we've seen some great benefits once you make your data rummageable and provide it to AI of benefits of running the experiments in the lab itself. But that's not the only question that keeps our leadership and our boards and our shareholders awake at night. They also look at organizational questions. I mean, over the past 20 years, how many iterations have we had from, oh no, the most productive R&D organizations are individual autonomous lablets, and then the new head of R&D came in and said, no, we have to have one central organization. And then the new head came in and said, we have to outsource everything to academia. And then the new head came in and said, the point is not that if you organize your data well, it works better for one model or the other. The point is, if you organize your data well, you give yourself the organizational flexibility to do that. If you democratize the data that comes out of your lab, as I think the folks from Genentech called it, it doesn't matter how you organize. You can try, and you can change. It gives you much more flexibility from an organizational perspective to organize your lab experiments in whatever best way fits your culture or the time of day. That's particularly true in diagnostic companies where labs is what they do every day, right? It's the product that they bring to market. Typically, the way lab companies start is a couple of brilliant scientists in a small lab somewhere, and they go to market as an LDT, right? Laboratory developed test. And you are allowed to do that as long as you run the test within that lab only. And lo and behold, the test becomes successful, and you want to market an IVD. Today, that's a rebuild, because none of the scientists properly engineered the software pipelines and so on and so forth. So investing in your data infrastructure gives you much more flexibility from an organizational perspective, from a scale-up perspective, but also from a portfolio perspective. The most tedious, the most daunting, and the least rewarding project you can ever give to your IT organization is selling one of your compounds. A close second is buying a new compound, but then at least you can blame the biotech. Selling one of your compounds means that you, again, have to rummage through your data, and if you haven't properly organized it, it takes months. Once you've organized it, you can reduce that to days. But without that, literally you go through lab notebooks, and this one stays, and that one goes to the other company, and so on and so forth. The carve-out, as we used to call it, of a molecule from your portfolio is a really, really daunting, expensive, lengthy task that, again, you can reduce the complexity, the cost, and the timelines of that from months to days. Because, and I realize I'm probably preaching to the converted here, the product that we all make in R&D is data. Data is our product. When you out-license a molecule, you don't out-license a protein structure, you out-license the data that you have about that structure. When you go to the FDA, you don't send them an envelope full of molecules, you send them data about the safety, toxicity, efficacy of your product. Even when you go to commercial, you tell your commercial colleagues about the efficacy, who's responding, who isn't. So the product of our enterprise is data. And that data is going to live all the way along the product life cycle, long after the molecule leaves our labs, right? After the molecule progresses from your labs, hopefully, colleagues in clinical development will be writing investigator brochures, will be submitting INDs, and a few years later you will be submitting to the FDA. And again, you have beautiful AI modules today that actually help your colleagues write those submissions if you make the data available. If those new AI products can, again, rummage through your lab data to help draft that IND application or that regulatory submission, right? A last example that I'll share is that the benefits even extend well beyond after you launch your molecule to the market, your new drug. It will happen every so many years or so that your blockbuster will fail. And that's not anyone's fault. It's just by law of numbers, right? Every so many years, you will think it will be a blockbuster. Your leadership will think it will be a blockbuster. Your board members, your shareholders will think it will be a blockbuster. But a signal emerges. And again, that's law of numbers because you only test your new drug in so many samples and so many patients before you go to market. And then hopefully it becomes successful. And within a few months, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of patients are using your drug in the wild, and a signal emerge. A safety signal or an efficacy signal, and the only saving grace you have then is your data. The only option you have to rescue your drug at the time is to, rummage through your data. I can give you a real example of that when I was working at a diagnostics laboratory. The way you do R&D in diagnostics, so 3 to 5 years, you collect samples of positives and negatives, you bank them, and then after 3 to 5 years, your assay is ready. You run the assay against all the positives or negatives, and then you have your sensitivity and specificity, and you launch, right? Our specificity was not good. We had too many false positives. But because our data was rummageable, what we were able to do is link the samples that we collected at the time to the current health records. And what we were able to see is that patients who were supposedly negative, actually within 6 to 12 months after they contributed the sample, turned positive. So we did not have a specificity problem. Our sensitivity was better than the current screening levels. Now that's a much better message, obviously, to launch your diagnostic with, right? So that was really a saving grace because we had made our data fair or rummageable, however you want to call it. Last point I will add to that is, so I spent the last 3 years verifying our data at a diagnostics company. We produced about 10,000 lab samples per day, so it's quite a big volume, and we made a big clinical genomic database of 10 million rummageable records. Technology was the easy part. The technology is done. The technology is way ahead of our organizational capability. The challenges we ran into was, that wasn't even proverbial. That guy somewhere out in the lab from a small company that we bought saying, you can't have my data because it's mine and I need approval from the SVP before I can share my data with you. Like, dude, we bought your company, get over yourself. And we screen scraped his data over the weekend without him knowing it. But that's a different story. The point is, if you want to make your investment in the technology yield, you got to properly set it up. It's not just about the technology, it's about the process and the people as well. You will be running into a data privacy officer who's going to ask, is this PHI? And maybe a protein structure is not a PHI, but according to 9 states in the US, a genomic structure is. So these are all the questions that you'll have to work through, and that's where the real heavy lift is going to be, and where I think you can benefit from some expertise from. That's a segue to you, Raveen. Where are you? Right there.
Thank you, Joris. Okay, so those were a lot of real world, real lived experiences. And it kind of ties back to this where, okay, if you have a data foundation where you have the data collected and it's fair, you can do those use cases that Joris was talking about. Knowledge management, so knowing what you have. How does that data get in there? It's connected instruments. It's having lab ops supporting your scientists so they don't have to wait around for reagents, for other consumables. It's wrapping a digital culture around this, and then having the right governance, operating model, automation, and orchestration to make this as efficient as possible. So the message here is that it's not just a technology problem. All of this has to come together to move the needle in productivity, particularly in your labs. But being here at this conference, AWS and Deloitte, we're going to talk about the tech enablement journey here. How do we accelerate that with you, for you? So what we're building is, going from left to right, is a systematic, scaled, orchestrated, governed way to move data from your instruments or on-prem servers, your Isilon servers, moving that in an organized way using AWS native services, the primitives, which I'll go into in a minute, and getting that moved to the cloud, having a control tower around that movement, okay? So you can start thinking about, well, I've got 10 instruments in this room in one lab. You start multiplying that out. I think I've seen stats where, large top 10 pharma companies have on the order of 5, 6, 7,000 instruments, right? All over the world, geographically, you've got labs that are external, that are sending data. So having a control tower that helps you see what's happening, what's failed, what's moved okay, is super important. There's also a ton of detail. You think, hey, I'm just moving a file from point A to point B. But if you're living that experience, there's a ton of detail in there that we've gotten into. So for instance, I've got a panel of experiments. I want to wait until all those experiments are done before I move the data, because it's no use moving like a piece by piece. Let's move it all at once, right? So all these business rules can be incorporated into this data movement capability. And then once you get it into the cloud, okay, you got to, we talked about making the data fair. You got to have that complete metadata record about the samples, about the experimental design. So having integrations to where that metadata lives, your metadata repositories, your ELNs, in some cases your LIMS systems, your lab execution systems, all of those need to be integrated, right? So as the data flows, the metadata comes with it, and it's stored in a data foundation. And those data foundations, they form data products. They're foundational data products that we can explain to you. There are data products that are built for supporting AI and ML. And then what we do is we apply standards where it makes sense. So the Allotrope Foundation has a lot of good standards. They're not always adopted, but it's a place to start, right? Then you've got the consumption on the back end. So how do we do this? So as I mentioned, we use AWS Data Sync, the Greengrass IoT framework for messaging. That's to get the data movement. S3, obviously, Data Zone for governance, and then Healthomics, Bedrock, and SageMaker Unified Studio for some of the bioinformatics and AI. But this is all modular. So this isn't obviously the entire universe. It plugs into many different types of applications, right? So what do we actually do? We take these, you can think of these as, the small Lego blocks in a Lego block set. This will be the one with the one nub or the two nubs, right? And, if you love that kind of stuff, you'll spend days or weeks building up your, Millennium Falcon Star Wars thing. So what we do is we prepackage that, right? So we make them into these big Lego blocks that make it easier to deploy. A lot of the tinkering has been taken out of the equation, and it's been parameterized, so it's much simpler. So the key is it's still working off of that tried and true scalable cloud native componentry, right? That's what we're talking about here. And so what we're doing is we're building this and have built it with client feedback in mind. So the core tenets are open, modular, cloud native, scalable, and standards-based where it makes sense. So we're not interested in holding your data hostage, where you might have to go to somebody else's cloud and download it into yours. We're interested in making it as modular as possible. So if you have a fantastic knowledge graph, if you have all your data verified, maybe your problem is possibly you need to get the data into that environment as fast and as efficiently as possible. So it's modular. You pick what makes sense for you, right? So what we've been doing is working with AWS. We've developed the core framework around this, around the data movement. We are at this point right now where we are working with clients and looking for more clients to try this out within their environment, to deploy it and configure it and customize it within their environment at 1-2 lab scale, or at an entire site, or labs across the world to bring that information together. As we're doing that, we're still we're working in many things in parallel. So another aspect of it is working to define data products and how they should come together, working with partners to build integrations to ELN and LIMS systems. And then what we're also have in the pipeline is later on in the year is the ability to perform multimodal analysis. So we'll have a flavor of it. There's other vendors, there's other partners that will have a flavor of it. But the idea is you've got all this data coming in. You've got the complete metadata record. You've got external data and publications and at collaborators. How do you pull that together across the different modalities, across the different experiment types, where they weren't really intended to be integrated or work together, right? And that's where the remit of using specific LLMs for that domain to extract the entities, extract the knowledge, and populate. One methodology is to populate a knowledge graph so you can look for those correlations. So that's coming out later. So really, you can think of this as the left to right is your flow of your data. You got to get it, move it efficiently to the cloud. You got to organize it, integrate it, and then you got to use it for benefit, right? So what we're looking for are early access clients. We've already got some. We'd like some more. Really, it's to be involved. Give us your feedback. Try this out. Help us with your priorities. What are things that you really want to crack, right? What problems do you want to solve now rather than later so we can tweak our roadmap? And then, of course, there's incentives and investments that go along with this, so it's a collaborative journey. And really, it's to essentially get this pipeline moving much more efficiently. Impact. We've talked about this, right? It's really you want to create better, highly differentiated therapeutics or drug candidates faster, right? With less hassle, with less friction, more automation. The idea is you want to give time back to your scientists to spend on science, not because you want to reduce your workforce, that would be foolish, but because you want those scientists to be able to work and progress a larger pipeline, right? So you want them to be productive, you want them to be happy, and that's what we're about. So thank you.